Welcome to the video, and today we would be going over the chess problem. I think it's called the Queen's Attack problem. And the unfortunate thing is that had a little bit of recording difficulties, kind of lost the film, like half of the film. So you guys are actually going to be watching me recap what I learned. But I will say, if you guys were to watch me do this from scratch, I literally sat there for 2 to 3 hours just writing down math and getting things wrong. So it's probably a good thing that you guys are watching me recap rather than solve it for the first time.
I came to a solution to some extent, and let's talk about it, right? So, the solution that I have currently passes 12 test cases out of 22, so it's missing 10. And there are a few areas that I looked at that I was like, okay, this might be a problem. And let's just basically walk through the logic of this. So, I think I've shown you guys this, and this works completely fine. Basically, we are first caring about the horizontal potential indices that contain the green circles or whatnot. We take a start index of the left side and an end index of the right side. We see if there are any obstacles that are within that space, and if there are, we basically change the start index to be the in this case it would be the column value of such obstacle, right? You guys can just look through this and understand it. It's a lot to explain. And then, because we are only considering spaces that aren't included with the chess piece, we subtract 1, since any index will always contain this, any start to end index range will always contain the chess piece. Here we do the exact same thing. We reset the indices, or the start and stop indices, and then we roll through the for loop, and we do the exact same process again, right? And then we move to the diagonals. And the diagonals are very tricky. So off screen, I did not almost. I did 3 pages of math, full pages of math. And eventually I was like, okay, well, let me just say this. I was trying to find a solution that only required me to keep track of one coordinate. So instead of keeping track of both the x and y, I could only keep track of the x or y and come to a solution that way. And I think it's possible, but working through the math for it was just too much of a pain in my butt. And 3 pages in, I'm like, man, this is just taking too long. So I ended up saying, whatever, I'm going to brute force this and see what I can come up with. And basically, I decided that I'm going to use both use both x and y when considering diagonals. So let's just walk through a little bit of the math here. I would like you guys to direct your attention over to the chessboard and look at the queen's position, right? So if we're going to define a diagonal, you can very easily tell that a diagonal is kind of defined as moving in 1x, 1y in any direction, right? And it can be positive or negative x or y. So in this case, when we're moving up and to the left, or we are considering the start index of our negative diagonal, you can tell that, okay, we're going to move, in the same fashion, we're going to move 1 to the left, 1 up, and we're going to do that until we hit a wall. And the way you determine whether or not it's a wall is kind of simple. You basically take the minimum between the two values. In theory, these values should never actually be different, but when you hit a wall, before another one, then they will be different, and that's kind of why. Basically, when the rule stops working, that's how you know that you've hit a wall. So let's just we'll take a quick look at this. So n is 8 and our row is 4. So 8 minus 4 is 4, okay? And that would correspond to a change of okay, here is our n, right? We're 8 tall minus our row position, which is 4. And that corresponds to a movement of 4 vertically, right? Now, if you're to take the column, which is also 4, minus 1 is 3. And that corresponds to the movement here of 3. And if you take the minimum of those, it's 3. And as you can see, that corresponds to our diagonal movement here. There's 3 spaces that we move in this direction, okay? So now that we have that, we can basically, there's some math that we can do to find the end index. And the way that I did that, it's kind of cool. There's a cool relationship. So if you look here, our position is x is 1, y is 7. If we're going, horizontal and then vertical, x and y. Our end of our diagonal would be down here at 7, right? So we would actually end up at 1, 7. So we go from 7, 1 to 1, 7. And I don't feel like going through the math to prove it to you guys, but this rule holds up that no matter where your start index is, if you're considering a negative diagonal, it'll always be that the inverse is your end index. So basically, we set the end x to our start y, our end y to our start x. Bam, done. And then we consider the diagonals obstacles. And so we basically leverage the properties of diagonals here to find which obstacles lay on a diagonal. And the way that we do that is, because a negative diagonal, the way that it works is for any increase in height, you lose. There's an inverse relationship. If you increase your height, you lose your x value. If you decrease your y, you increase your x. So there's an inverse relationship, and we basically just check to make sure that the inverse relationship exists here. So assuming our obstacle is, let's just do one of height of what, 3? No. X of 3 and a y of 5. Our guy's at position 4, 4. You take 4 minus 3, you get 1, okay? And then you take 4 minus 5, and you get negative 1. And as you can see, that's literally right here. Both of those calculations are right here, and they equal each other. So I'm not going to explain all of this. You guys can kind of infer what all of this means, but basically we're taking the most restrictive possible obstacle. Like if there's multiple obstacles that lay on like one direction of a diagonal, we take the most restrictive one. So in our case, this would be 3, 5 if we had like multiple obstacles in these three ranges. And then we essentially just take the absolute value between the start x and end x, and basically the same reason as before. I actually do have to validate this. Like you'll see I have like a note here that says validate this, and I can't really say for certain that this always works. But like if you were to just take something like this and you were to say, okay, our start x is at 0 or is at 1 and our end x is at 7, the count would be 6 in this case, which corresponds correctly here. As you can see, there's 6 green circles. And then we move on to the positive diagonal, and the positive diagonal follows some similar rules, although different. We take n minus our column, or n minus our row, n minus our column, and we take the minimum between those two values. In this case, it perfectly aligns in a corner, and so they're equal to each other, so it just takes literally either of them. We then add that to our current, we add 4 to our delta to our current position. In this case, our delta was 4, and our chess piece's position is at 4, 4. So we end up at 8, 8, which, accurately is our end index. And then the formula to retrieve the start index is a little funky, but it still works. You take 1 plus n minus the end x, and notice these are kind of inverted. So for start y, you use end x. For start x, you use end y. And then you take n minus that. And I'm not going to validate the math. You guys can do that yourself, but it works. And then if you move down to the positive diagonal, we follow basically the same process. We confirm that the obstacle lies on the diagonal path. And we do this by basically just checking the same property of diagonals. Like if our obstacle's position was 5, 5, right? You would say 5 minus 4 is 1. 5 minus 4 is again 1, and those equal each other. And you could do that for everything along either of these two directions. I mean, you could also call them 1, but I'm going to distinguish them as two different directions. And literally the same exact process follows here. This is nothing special. You guys have seen this, 4 times now? And then again, we just add the count. So let me talk a little bit about what went wrong, what went right, okay? So when I was programming the solution for this, one of the first things that stuck out to me was that these are definitely 8 separate directions, and they're separate mostly because of the obstacles and their relative position to the queen. But I did realize that technically you could make these all just four separate directions. Like I'm calling this the negative diagonal and this the positive diagonal, horizontal and vertical. And it works out that you can just like control the start and end indices of these. And I went with that option mainly for memory and complexity reasons because by not having to manage 8 different directions and at least 8 different variables, you basically just save a little bit of memory and a little bit of complexity. Compute wise, I can't say that it's any more efficient, but I also haven't really thought through that. Let's talk about the diagonals. Okay, so the diagonals are really the stickler here. Out of all of the processes that you could follow, the diagonals are really what make it hard to complete a solution to this. And there's a bunch of relationships you could draw from here. Like if you just work through the math, there's like so many relationships. And really they're like the patterns are not that complex. Like you can really deduce some pretty reasonable information from this. So much so that I really tried to go straight for the kill shot here. I was basically trying to avoid extra complexity by considering one or the other. Because if you look at this, you could say if you had a start index that it was at x equals 1 and it finishes obviously down here at 1 x equals 7, you could say the difference between x equals 1 and x equals 7 is 6, which accurately portrays the amount of circles we see here. But basically, as you get working through, like, how do I retrieve a start index? Okay, now how do I, count the length? Okay, now I got to consider how I, factor in, like, obstacles and stuff and how much that reduces the length. It just gets very convoluted and kind of hard to follow. But the math is definitely there to do it, I think. I mean, I can't confirm that, but I believe it is. What did I do wrong in this? What I did wrong was I went for the kill shot for the solution. A lot of the times, not always, but often, going for a brute force solution or a solution that is not completely optimal is in fact the best way to go about this. If I would have been given this question in an interview, I would have definitely failed. I took almost like 2 or 3 hours doing this question. So when you guys are working through this, especially if you're in an actual interview, you're probably going to want to practice just coming up with a solution and optimizing later. And I do want to recognize that not always can you optimize from a solution. Like if you were to brute force a solution and end up with like an n squared like nested for loop solution, you're not always going to be able to like backtrack to like a constant time solution or something. A lot of the times as you're working through solutions, like you'll go down different branches. And in order to like optimize, you have to backtrack. You can't just like reduce or like fix complexity. Like you have to fully backtrack to a solution that's completely different than your own. And that's like my personal issue with going for brute force solutions is that sometimes it's a waste of time. Sometimes it doesn't help you to optimize your solution and get to the point that you need at all. But in this case, I would definitely say brute forcing the solution would have helped me a lot because I wouldn't have sat here and wrote 3 pages of math and not came up with a solution, 2 or 3 hours of work. The other thing I would like to know is that I wrote like 3 pages of math. Like I spent probably 10 minutes coding to my 2.5, 3 hours, 2 hours of programming or of writing math. An anecdote I would probably use to like explain why this is like such a important point is when I first started web development, I would go in and I would build websites and stylistically I would just make everything with CSS right then and there. Like if I had an idea for what I wanted to do, I would just run in there with some CSS and start changing stuff, okay? And that it will never be as efficient as working with something like Figma and just drag and dropping and resizing boxes and typing in text. Like Figma's just fast, right? Prototyping is very quick in Figma, whereas prototyping with CSS is slow. And so when you guys are doing this, if you're not confident that you have a solution, I would not really worry about writing code. I think that even if you were in an interview, you could probably get away with not coding even a little bit if you had a very, very good verbal explanation. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to touch on was I tried very hard to avoid considering both the x and y indices, and that was a mistake on my part, like a very large mistake, because I could have came up with this exact same solution in probably 2 hours less of time, maybe an hour and a half less of time. Like I could have done this in under an hour if it wasn't for the fact that I tried very hard to avoid the x, considering both x and y coordinates. And when you're doing stuff, the main takeaway I would say from that is not considering the x and y kind of meant that I had to spend hours of work trying to find a solution, whereas considering them basically only meant a negligible memory increase because I had to keep track of both variables. It meant a negligible complexity increase because I just had to consider both coordinates. There was a minor, if not inexistent, increase to compute complexity. Like, if you guys are just looking at my screen really quick, you can see like it's all just basic arithmetic. Like nothing in here is too complex. I'm not like having those extra variables is not ruining my code. It's not making it run slow. There's not that many extra operations going on. Overall, adding 2 variables would have cut me an hour and a half of time and like saved me like it would have it adds like I don't know a couple of microseconds. Like it's negligible. But that's the thing. So another point that I would like to touch on is that, and this is relevant, is that your solutions most people are only going to care about your compute complexity. I heard somewhere in a quote, I couldn't remember it now, but they said something along the lines of compute is like very difficult to have, it's costly, it's expensive, but it like whereas memory is basically you have as much of it as you want, I guess. I don't really know why or how, but you do. And so when you're making these solutions, memory is basically negligible. You throw that to the side. What you really need to care about is compute. And in my solution here, like I said, all I would have done is increase the memory, right? It wouldn't have messed with the compute all that much. And then as for, there's another thing you need to consider, and that's complexity. And now complexity is a different one. It's kind of a whole beast in its own because it's not exactly cut and dry. What people consider complex is not cut and dry. There's nuances to this. I'm getting a little overboard, but complexity is generally a negligible thing. Most of the time you can get away with having overly complex code. I've heard that in the interviews, if you have like complex code that could be like reduced, every now and then they'll tell you like, okay, go in and optimize your code, make it less complex. But if your complexity is not affecting your time, it's much less of a factor. First, you got to get to a solution. Second, if you want to make sure that solution's optimized, right? I would say complexity is one of the last factors you can consider. And me personally, I was far too concerned about complexity in this case. As you saw, I was trying to reduce how many variables I used from, one coordinate to two. Like it was a negligible difference. There is, in fact, a nuance to this, though. Complexity does matter, but it only matters when you need to start, like when your solution has to handle a shit ton of exceptions. Like a lot of the times, if you're writing code and you start catching yourself using a lot of if statements to handle certain exceptions, you can pretty confidently say that your solution is not going to work. Like, let me just show you guys this. And my code actually works, and a lot of this is just fluff from like console log statements and whatnot. Like if I reduce it, it would look a lot better. But just look at how much code I wrote here, okay? And now let's just go take a look at the actual solutions. Look at this. These are all in less than 30 lines, except for this one, right? 30 lines, 40 lines, they're all very, very compact. And you'll notice that almost every solution hackering throws at you will in fact have a simple solution. It'll not be very complex. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you absolutely are positive that you could come to a solution by increasing complexity, in my case I was positive. I knew for a fact that if I had both indices, both the x and y indices for start and end, that I would be able to come to a solution, then sometimes you should go that route. But when you're not exactly confident that you can come to a solution by adding complexity, but you're like, oh, but it might work, and if I handle enough exceptions, it might work, and if I make it flow this way, that's probably not going to do you very well. Just keep mind of like how many if statements you're using, because generally that's a good sign that you're doing something wrong. Let's go look over here at a solution that I really like. I was absolutely glazing this when I made the video originally, but I stopped making it because I realized I wasn't screen sharing. This is such a cool solution. So you guys are going to like this. Here we take the obstacles, which is originally an array, and we convert it into a set. Once we convert it into a set, they make a directions variable, and the directions basically correspond to the 8 different directions that a queen could move. So this is moving, pause. The x and y are actually reversed. They're actually considering y and then x in this situation. So basically this is a y, this is an x. So it's an increase of y by 1 and a decrease of x by -1. Understand that these are the different directions, okay? So what they do is they consider every single direction, and that's where you get here. They're unpacking the tuples. And they're saying that basically they're literally just taking these directions and then moving in that direction repeatedly until they hit a wall. And you can see here that this is like code to make sure that they're not hitting a wall or they're hitting an obstacle. And it basically just does this until it hits one or the other, and as it's doing this, it increases the count. And I just think that's such a cool solution, and it's a solution that I saw in my head when I first looked at this problem, but I was like, nah, that's too slow. And it is kind of too slow. It's an n plus k solution. If you ask ChatGPT, let me see. See, it's a k plus n solution right there. And I think it was good, but it wasn't good enough. And here's my reasoning behind why it wasn't good enough. It relies way too heavily on, I would say, almost programming, because they're utilizing loops here, and they're basically forcing a shit ton of different states. Like they're forcing themselves to be in every possible state that this thing could be in, whereas my code does not rely on that. My code is much more of, it's mathematically derived more, I'd say. Look at the loops. This is a nested loop. This is already a bad sign, okay? This is a bad sign. This is an elegant solution. Don't get me wrong. It's so elegant, but it's not the most efficient. The nested loop should immediately throw a flag. And like when you're just looking at this, you kind of know, basically do something where you force the queen to explore all the different, like move in certain directions until it hits a wall. Like that's an immediately obvious solution. But then you have to also acknowledge that your queen basically, if you're going to do that, it has to exist in every one of these states. And that's a lot of states to exist in when you don't need to. And so my solution actually runs in O of k, I think it was. And the only reason that it runs in O of k is because it has to check and see if an obstacle lies in its path. And I do wonder if it's possible for me to... It's definitely possible. I could actually reduce this, and possibly I could go to constant time. That's really cool. So my solution could go to constant time if I were to put the obstacles into a set and then basically take their difference from the queen. That's really cool. I actually kind of want to go back and try to make this like as physically efficient as possible. But yeah, guys, I don't know. This is like, to me, when I look at this, alarm bells are going off in my head. This is like a near constant time solution, if not constant time. And the person who came up with the elegant solution in Python did a very good job of like making what I would consider a brute force solution. But ultimately, my solution of going like a more mathematically derived way pays off complexity wise, or time complexity wise. Anyhow, guys, kind of a long winded video. I was trying to keep it short. I hope you guys learned something from this. Have a good day, guys.